Hi all, welcome to another bonus episode of the Leading Safely podcast. Today we're chatting with Paul Dubois. Paul is the CEO and founder of Appenate, a no-code platform for creating line of business apps with customers in 40 plus countries. Prior to Appenate, Paul worked in enterprise software for the health insurance, financial services, construction, utilities and resource industries. For over 15 years, Paul has led remote teams operating in multiple countries and time zones, delivering quality solutions to large and small customers. I will add a disclaimer here that the topic that Paul is about to speak about is timely and might be a little bit difficult in content to listen to, or may even be a trigger. If the content of this episode is challenging or triggers you in any shape, way or form, please do tune out now and seek help through your normal support networks or by reaching out to services like Lifeline on 13 11 14 or access www.blackdoginstitute.com.au and click Get Help Now. Alternatively, you can also seek help by chatting with your GP. Right, now that we've got that covered, let's get into it, shall we? Hi Paul, thanks again for taking time out of your busy schedule to meet with me and having a chat around clinical burnout. It seems to be a very current issue at the moment, especially with the new code of practice on psychosocial risk and everything that seems to be in the media. So appreciate you sharing your journey with us. As you know, I'll be asking all of my special guests these three general questions because I'm interested and really like to know the answers. It gives me different perspectives. So first question for you is, in your experience working with companies establishing health and safety protocols, what do you think is important to be an effective leader in this space?
Thanks for having me on. I think if it comes down to establishing anything, whether it's health and safety protocols or any other kind of process, probably the most important thing is to try and get buy-in ahead of time. You don't really want to show up on a Monday morning with a whole new set of protocols that need to be implemented out of the blue. It's something you want to actually sound out amongst people first, I think. As with anything, there are always multiple ways to skin the cat. So try and find the way that really works for your company and your particular demographic set of people, their needs and all those sorts of things. I think a lot of protocols and procedures and processes fail not because they aren't reasonable or good processes, but because they've been brought in such a way that they essentially get people to arc up from the start. And if you're doing it that way, no matter what you're doing, it's going to be really tough to get through.
That actually ties into one of the other questions as well. So in that case, what would be your words of wisdom for someone dealing with people who don't want to change or that are arcing up, like you just said in that regard then?
Look, I think sometimes we forget that companies are not like these machines. They're a collection of people. So when you start thinking in that direction, to me, successful companies are ones that have found a particular formula, particular method of operating that suits their personnel. And as a result, they have good outcomes. So when you're talking about bringing in anything, and particularly health and safety type stuff, sometimes it can become a real sort of black and white sort of situation where it's kind of us versus them. And I think you got to step back in those situations and take the conversation away from what you're trying to implement and bring it back to what problem you're actually trying to solve. If the problem is, hey, people are getting injured on site, have the discussion about that. Start the discussion there. Start the introduction of whatever protocols you're bringing in at the problem. Get people agreeing that there is a problem, first of all. And, again, some people are stubborn and they're not going to accept that there is even a problem. So again, being able to motivate things and being able to make a case for the problem and why it is an issue and why it needs to be addressed, I think is the first step in getting people on side, right? Because otherwise, and this is the reputation I think health and safety generally has, fairly or unfairly earned, is that it's a bunch of people putting a bunch of checklists together that actually don't mean anything. And when people are not able to connect with the problem that you're trying to solve, then that's exactly what it's going to be, right? It's just going to be another thing that they got to do every day because some person in an office said so. So I think if you can bring people along and help them understand really the core of why that's in place, then straight away you have people who feel they have a stake in the conversation. And I think the other thing is you've got to be flexible and, as far as possible, be willing to adjust or adapt, whatever you're proposing to fit the personnel that you have. If I work in tech, obviously, so we have a software solution that goes out and is used a lot in health and safety to kind of produce apps that people can use, but for all kinds of purposes. But if your workforce is, I don't know what, technology illiterate, right?
Yep.
Then showing up with a whole bunch of apps, no matter how shiny and powerful they are, it doesn't matter because you're actually mismatching, right? So you got to give people a solution that actually suits where they are, as opposed to whatever is the industry standard or the best practice or whatever. Rather work with what you got than try and force something upon people.
That's fantastic. And it sounds like you were saying people are not the solution, the problem is the solution.
Yeah.
Focusing on the problem as opposed to focusing on the person or the attitudes that you potentially are getting from that person.
Absolutely.
Take it back to what's the problem and what are we dealing with.
Yeah, and look, you're always going to have that very small subset of people who just hate change full stop or just refuse to, toe the line. And I think that becomes a bigger conversation anyway about their suitability for your organization, right?
100%.
You want everyone in the boat, rowing in the same direction. But there's lots of ways you can get people to row in the same direction. And I certainly espouse the one where everyone understands why we're rowing in that particular direction.
Yeah, I completely agree. And final question, from a vendor's perspective, if you could invent something to solve a health and safety issue in the workplace where expenditure, opinions and all that other stuff didn't matter, what would you invent and why, obviously, aside from what you've already created?
Look, I think there's a lot of interesting things just going on generally in the tech space. I certainly think that things like augmented reality is only going to grow as technology options. But, given the nature of the question, I would love to have some kind of, I just love to invent some kind of like anti-dumbass bracelet. Yeah. Just because I think a lot of stuff happens, and if we're talking in health and safety context, a lot of health and safety issues are just because people are being dumbasses, right? Like they're being idiots. They're, I don't know, walking on the edge of a building. Mm-hmm. Not because they have to, but because they're having a laugh, or whatever it is. Mm-hmm. Just doing stupid stuff, right? So I think if we had some kind of bracelet that, I'm not saying it should give you an electric shock, although that has crossed my mind, but just, gave you some kind of warning like, hey, maybe rethink your choices right now. I'm not saying it would solve problems, but I think it would hopefully avert some of the worst ones that are often just because people have been stupid, right? It's not because there weren't protocols in place or they weren't trained or inducted or whatever it is. It's just because they were being, just being stupid, right? So I think something like that would be awesome.
I have a 2-year-old, so I think it might come in handy from the toddler age group.
This has got widespread applications, trust me. I think you could fit the drivers on the road with them.
And you heard it here first, hey?
That's right.
The new bracelet coming out that will zap you when you're about to have an at-risk behaviour or
That's
something
right.
like that.
Yeah.
That's really interesting because I'm not sure how we segue into the next part of the conversation.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's great to hear those insights and that kind of understanding around what it is that really needs to happen and taking it back to the problem as opposed to that emotional connection with people. And there is no segue, so I guess I understand from chatting earlier that you've had quite a journey when it comes to your own personal health and from a health and safety perspective, and obviously you said you've been diagnosed with clinical burnout. Is there anything that you could perhaps share with our listeners around your experience and the learnings that you've had from coming from that? I mention it to you because I'm not someone who
tends to hide behind things. It is part of what's happened to me, and I think it's definitely something that people are more willing to talk about these days than maybe 5-10 years ago. But I still think it has plenty of baggage that comes with the subject, of being burned out. The interesting thing is it's only been a few years ago that clinical burnout was recognized as an actual medical condition, as opposed to just something that people were proposing existed. I think if you understand it lives in the family of depression. So if you talk about clinical depression, clinical burnout is an offshoot of that, essentially. So it's a form of depression. It starts to make a lot more sense, and I think depression is something that people have certainly become more willing to speak about of late. There's a lot of stuff that I've kind of learned about it really over the years, and the thing with clinical depression is it's not something you can fix with a pill. I mean, pills help, and I'm still on an antidepressant, a fairly low dose, but the big thing to understand is, and this is what I think turned it for me, was it's actually it's a physiological problem, right? It's your brain. The way it's been explained to me, and I'm not a medical professional, so don't quote me on this, but when you work really, really hard for a very sustained period of time, which was the case for me, 10 plus years ago, I started up what has become Appenate, my software company, on my own, just trying to make something happen. And I was working extremely long hours. My mind was pretty much 100% absorbed by the company and the problems and the software I was trying to write and all those sorts of things. And you operate at a much higher level than you're accustomed to and that you actually thought you could. So in some ways, it's kind of euphoric, and you have some euphoric days where it's like, wow, I can't believe how much I'm getting done, right? But you're essentially running on adrenaline, okay? And your body produces adrenaline, in certain situations, but it's not really designed to produce adrenaline sort of all the time. And that's essentially what happened in my case is, I worked myself to a point where my physiology just could not produce sufficient amounts of adrenaline and other, chemicals that I think regulate your mood and particularly give you mood ranges, right? From heights of anger or heights of happiness to the really hectic parts of anger, right? And so essentially what happened is my body could not produce as much as it used to be able to. And so my moods and my well-being and everything really dipped as a result of that, because suddenly my body was producing far less than what would just be a natural normal balance, as opposed to what I had, I guess, become dependent on to operate. And so when it was explained to me like that, it made a ton of sense. And I think depression and burnout in particular have this connotation that it's just in people's heads. It's just like, oh, they're just tired or they're just exhausted. And sure, you can be tired and exhausted, but this is really something where your brain chemistry has actually changed. And there are studies now that have been coming out, and one that really caught my attention was there is actual neuron damage that's happening when your body is running on adrenaline and these chemicals for such sustained periods. And I mean, I'm talking about not a few days, I'm talking about years, right? And that's damage that as yet they're not sure if it can be repaired, right? Or if your body can regenerate those parts. I mean, this is all still fairly new findings, but what it essentially means is I have some form of brain damage at this point, right? I'm hoping it's not going to be permanent, but it also means that it's not a quick fix, right? And so clinical burnout to me is something that people need to be wary of and aware of. In our company, some of the changes I've tried to make is make sure people go home on time, or in the case of our remote setup, they close their computers and they don't come back to work, right, the rest of the day. Like, I have trained and encouraged the other leaders in our company to actively chase people away if they keep coming back, in the night, in nighttime or something to do some work. To me, it's not as important as having a healthy team, because it's like, do as I say, not as I've done in that case, right?
And you have that lived experience,
Absolutely.
Fortunately and unfortunately, to be able to speak from wisdom of here's what happens to you, unfortunately, if you go down that road.
Exactly. Yeah.
When they diagnosed you with the condition, were you provided with any coping strategies? Like, is there anything you could perhaps share with our listeners, once it's been recognised, or perhaps how to recognise it, and then what they can do if they do identify, hey, I think I'm experiencing this, strategies they can put in place?
Yeah, absolutely. For me, it went to the point where I had essentially a nervous breakdown, right? Mm-hmm. And I just fell apart. And so then I wound up, through a few doctors, I wound up in a psychiatrist's office, and that's where the diagnosis, was successfully sort of done. In terms of coping mechanisms, I can only talk from my experience. As I said, antidepressants were kind of the first thing they prescribed, and I'm not a pill person. I don't like taking stuff I don't need. Mm-hmm. And so I was quite resistant to that in the beginning. But again, once you understand the science, essentially the whole point of the antidepressants is to add back the chemicals that your body can't produce, or just is not producing in sufficient amount, right? So, I've been kind of begrudgingly on those pills, but I've understood the reason for it. Mm-hmm. It goes back to getting people to accept change, right? Once I understood, actually why it's being prescribed, and it's not just someone randomly giving me a script to try and solve my problems. Mm-hmm. That certainly makes a difference. So actually getting medical help.
Yeah.
It's not. I think, again, people go, I'll just take a few weeks off and I'll be fine and I'll recharge my batteries or whatever. Now, again, depending on where you're at, that might be fine, because it might give your body a chance to kind of get back to normal regulation. But if you've really been pushing it for a long time, and as I had, your body's broken, right? It's not going to fix itself anytime soon. And you actually need to get on to some medical advice, right? Mm-hmm. You just have to. And it sucks because, again, I didn't want to be a head case, right? But here I am. So it is what it is. I think the other thing that the other two major things that I've found, and this is what every psychiatrist, I think, prescribes at the top of the list, is sleep. I was maybe sleeping, I was quite proud of the fact that I was operating on about 6 hours sleep, or 5 to 6 hours sleep a day. Mm-hmm. And I was doing this for months and months on end, right? And then I'd have the odd crash where I'd sleep until friggin' midday or something, the next day or something like that. And I think that was enough and I'd be fine. But sleep is super important. And I've really had to change. I'm a night owl. I'm a software developer. We like writing code at the middle of the night. We have strange ideas in the middle of the night that we want to put down. I think artists and other people are like that too. I have had to really try and force myself to go to bed and get my 8 hours, 7.5 to 8 hours. And everyone's different, but that's it's super important. And my wife especially calls me out on it, but I also notice it more and more. If I have a few nights in a row where I'm not getting 7 or 8 hours, I can see the difference. I can see the deterioration in my condition, right? And this is three plus years later, So I think sleep's a big one. And besides your medical advice on sleep, the other big thing is exercise. Okay. Exercise releases endorphins and adrenaline and things like that, which makes you feel better, right? When you're in a situation where your body is, been cranking at those things, I find exercise really changes mood, and that sort of thing. And it's essentially a natural way of trying to address what the pills will also help you address, right? So, those are the three big things.
Perfect. So thanks obviously for sharing, the topic, and I'm sure, it's close to you, something you've experienced and lived, and I'm sure our listeners appreciate it as well. And thanks for sharing the insights, I guess, into the 3 questions and how to get people to change and focusing on the problem as the solution and not the person themselves. Thanks very much for coming out, sharing your experiences with us. Greatly appreciate it.
Wow. I am so appreciative for Paul sharing such a personal and heartfelt journey with all of us today.
As I said earlier in this episode, please do not hesitate to reach out to a relevant support service if you are experiencing anything slightly similar. That brings us to the end of another episode. Keep listening into the podcast though, as I'm now constantly meeting with new and exciting guests who want to share their journey and their messages with you. Until next time, stay safe.